Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Marie, and holy shit, we are up to part 5 of the ongoing Console Wars series. And today we're up to the 32-bit era. This is where things get interesting. Shit gets real in the 32-bit era. So let's start off by backtracking a little bit and let's talk about how we got here. The 16-bit era gave us the introduction to a new technology known as CD-ROM. We also started to see new techniques like 3D graphics and the birthing of what was at the time called virtual reality, which we kind of went back and forth on, and full motion videos and the introduction to story-based gaming. Video games with a story. This was all, the seeds of this was planted in the 16-bit era. The 32-bit era is where it really started to come into fruition. So the 32-bit era is the 3DO, the 32X, the Atari Jaguar, the Sega Saturn, and the Sony PlayStation. Now there are probably other consoles out there that might technically be 32-bit consoles, but they either had no impact on the market or they were exclusive to a foreign market and weren't released in the US. Therefore, they don't have any relevance to this discussion. So, we don't talk about them. Now, all but 2 of these are CD-ROM based, except the 2 that aren't CD-ROM based do have CD-ROM optional components, which does mean all 4 of, or 5 of the mainstream 32-bit consoles did have CD-ROM technology in one form or another. So let's start with 3DO. 3DO is kind of complicated because it wasn't one company. 3DO was a company called 3DO. That was the name of the company. But what they did was they designed a specification for a 32-bit CD-ROM based video game console that they licensed out to other manufacturers. So it was actually made by companies like Panasonic, Goldstar, Sanyo, AT&T, etc. Now, 3DO was very short-lived because it was very expensive, and there was no primary first-party development studio pushing games for it. Now, the 3DO company would invest in game developers like Naughty Dog and others, Crystal Dynamics, etc. Eventually forming their own game studio, 3DO Interactive or whatever it was called. But by the time they formed their own game studio, they had already discontinued the 3DO, and they were making games under the 3DO banner for other systems like N64 and PlayStation. So, like I said, it gets complicated. Now, the 3DO itself is probably the first technically 32-bit home console. I want to say mass market. But I don't know if that's 1,000% accurate, because one, I don't know if it came out before or after the Amiga CD32, which was exclusive to Europe, so it doesn't count. Or I don't know. I guess it depends on how you define things. But I'm going to say it was the first of the 32-bit era. It launched the 32-bit era. Now, we did get some iconic 32-bit games, franchises, etc. They got their start on the 3DO. For example, Gex turned into a big franchise for a little bit. Need for Speed turned into a great big franchise that is still going to this day. There may have been others. Those are the 2 off of the top of my head. And that's the problem with 3DO, is there's really not a lot on it. Most of the games that would have been popular on the 3DO, I've already talked about on the CD-ROM video, because they were just basically enhanced Sega CD games. So a good chunk, 50% or more, 60-70% probably, of the 3DO library are just Sega CD games with more colors and a little bit better resolution on the full motion video. That's it. That's all they are. So again, not a lot to be desired. You had a few standouts like Samurai Showdown, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. I think Doom was on the 3DO, but don't quote me on this. But there's not a lot once you get past the standouts. The 3DO is also interesting because it has a single controller port. So to get multiplayer games, you have a second controller port on the first controller, and you have to daisy chain controllers to get multiplayer, which means theoretically you could have a near unlimited number of controllers depending on what's the limit of the daisy chaining cables. But in practice, you didn't really have a lot of 2D or multiplayer games on the 3DO to begin with, because most of them were single player FMV pieces of shit. And they didn't have the 16-bit charm that their Sega CD counterparts did. So, honestly, the 3DO was kind of like a sampling of what 32-bit was going to come, what was to come in the 32-bit technology. But it was pretty limited, and it was kind of like, as far as demos go, it didn't sell us on 32-bit. It really didn't. Even the big hitters like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Samurai Showdown had perfectly adequate 16-bit counterparts, cartridge and CD-ROM. So again, it wasn't a big selling point. The next 32-bit system we have is also controversial because it's not technically a system. It's an upgrade for an existing system. And it didn't have a lot of games. This is the 32X. Now, the 32X is interesting because it's like the guts of a Sega Saturn, just like, super glued to a Sega Genesis, more or less. But it doesn't have like the full chipset of the Sega Saturn, so it's like almost a Saturn, but not quite. And it is running on the Genesis CPU, which means it has that bottleneck. So there's some debate whether or not it's technically a 32-bit system or not, because it is running on a primary 16-bit CPU. But we're getting into the messy nitty-gritty of the technicalities, which just brings us back to the fucking Bit Wars was bullshit all the way around. We already know this. But here we are. Now, the 32X has between 35 and 37 games released for it, depending on which region you're in, altogether. And that's it. Not a lot. A handful of arcade games, a handful of Saturn downgrades, and a handful of exclusive games for the system, and a handful of enhanced Sega Genesis Super Nintendo ports. So, not a lot. This is a good, for only having 35 games, give or take, it's got a surprisingly robust library, to be fair. You got a couple of fighting games. You've got Cosmic Carnage, which is an exclusive to the 32X and pretty good. And you've got Mortal Kombat 2, which is a game you're already over by the time it came out on the 32X, but still, okay, a pretty decent port of Mortal Kombat 2. And then you have Virtua Fighter, which again, if you don't have the money to go all in on the Saturn, it's a perfectly passable alternative to the arcade and an adequate, downgrade to the Saturn game. which we'll talk about in a minute. Then you've got some space shooters. You've got Star Wars Arcade, and you have Shadow Squadron. Shadow Squadron. And then you've got, like, you've got Zaxxon's Mother Base 2000, which is a semi-3D space shooter. And then you have, like, you have T-Mech, which is your mech game. And you have Colibri, which is a 32X exclusive. I don't know. I'm just gonna call it a Sega game because I don't know how do you categorize it. It's like Echo the Dolphin, only you're a hummingbird flying around the jungle, but that's what it is. By the way, Echo the Dolphin is on 32X, I believe. Maybe I'm mistaken. I know it's on Sega CD. Anyways. Then you have some arcade games like Afterburner is on the 32X, which is a good game. It's a good port of Afterburner. You got a handful of sports titles. All your primary sports are represented. Your main line, you know, hockey, football, baseball, basketball, wrestling. They're all represented. Racing, motocross, they're all there. Boxing, they're all golf, they're all there, you know. But nothing that, like, stands out as a must-have. You have a half-decent port of Doom at best. You have a pretty much carbon copy of Blackthorn from the Super Nintendo version. You have Primal Rage, which, again, you've already played on Sega or Super Nintendo, so what's the point? You know... Pitfall the Mayan Adventure, which wasn't even a great game to begin with. So it's like, I don't know, the 32X overall was kind of funky-dory, you know? It was one of those, like, half steps. It was, like, intended to give more life to the Genesis and keep Genesis owners happy for a little bit longer while they saved up money to buy a Saturn, I guess. But if you dropped $150 on a 32X... and $50 to $70 per cartridge on a 32X software library, you spent the money you would have saved up to buy a Saturn. So I guess you either went all in and got burned, or oops, you got fucked. Next, we have the Atari Jaguar. Do not come at me with it's a 64-bit console. No, it the fuck ain't. It has a 64-bit system bus running on a 32-bit CPU. That's it. Fuck off. It's a 32-bit game console. And it's a shitty one at that. Nothing on the Atari Jaguar looks any better than anything at all on the 32X. So if that's 64-bit, my mom's a werewolf. And I'm pretty sure my mom ain't a fucking werewolf. So... fuck off. The Jaguar isn't worth talking about. It pretty much is what put Atari out of business, more or less. It's complicated, but we're just going to skim over it. Now we're going to jump into the real meat and potatoes of the 32-bit era. The Sega Saturn versus the PSX or Sony PlayStation. This was the console war you're here for. You didn't give a shit about 3DO or 32X or Jaguar. You're like, come on, girl, talk about the good stuff. So, Sega Saturn started out as an arcade board that Sega wanted to bring to the home consoles because Sega's all about them arcade games back in the 90s when arcades were still making money. And PlayStation has a whole messy, complicated history about, you know, fucking over Nintendo, etc. You can learn about it elsewhere. Norm, the gaming historian, has a good video on it. So I'm not going to get into it here. Once the Sega Saturn came on the scene, however, the 32-bit race was on. The PlayStation came out sometime later. So once we had both systems in stores you could buy, it was, you know, it was time for the war, the real console war. So Saturn had the disadvantage of competing with itself in that you had a choice between Big Brother Saturn or Little Brother 32X, which meant Sega fans were torn between either one, sticking with Genesis and buying a 32X, two, jumping into the Saturn, or saying, fuck it, let's just buy a PlayStation. This is what most of them did, myself included, for a lot of different reasons. Saturn also was notoriously difficult to develop games for. So even if a game came out on Saturn, a lot of times it was buggy and blocky and shitty in comparison to its PlayStation or Windows 95 counterpart. Or if it didn't have a counterpart, it just was buggy and blocky and shitty anyways, like the aforementioned Virtua Fighter port, which sucks so bad, Sega had to recall it and reissue it under Virtua Fighter Remix. And they had to give it away for free because they were like, oops, we fucked up. Because the port was rushed and sloppy and shitty. The Saturn had a lot of rushed, incomplete games, which didn't look good on the market in comparison to the robust, polished, fully developed games on the Sony PlayStation. This is not to say the Saturn flat out sucks, because it doesn't, or to say the Saturn doesn't have a few good games, because it does. But at the time, gamers were noticing that if a game was on both systems, for the most part, it was functional on the PlayStation and not so much on the Saturn. And you couldn't patch games with DLC or anything back then. You either had to reissue the game with a patch, like, or a sequel, or a special edition, or a director's cut, or whatever. Which, who the fuck is going to buy a game twice just because to fix the bugs you didn't get out in the first place? Yeah, right. And then there were examples of a game that was so rushed that they put out an incomplete game and then packaged the rest of the game as a sequel. They did this with Bug and Clockwork Knight. Two games that were so rushed that it shows. Clockwork Knight looks like a 32X or Sega Genesis game with maybe slight color enhancements, and that's it. It looks like a game that could run on the 32X or the Genesis itself. Bug looks a little better in the 3D department, but not by much. You had a few shining examples, like Mr. Bones was pretty good. Panzer Dragoon was pretty good. Virtua Cop was pretty good. Virtua Fighter 2 was pretty good. You know, there were a handful of good games on the Saturn. Good quality games on the Saturn. But we all know this story. We know how this story ends. PlayStation won that console war. Saturn, when it was all said and done and the dust settled and it was forgotten and buried, barely sold 10 million units, whereas PlayStation sold over 100 million units. That's, I don't even know the ratio, but that's not an ass whooping. That's a fucking beat down. PlayStation was where it was at. PlayStation right out the gate had games like PO'd and Primal Rage and Doom and Mortal Kombat 3. It had fucking Need for Speed and the previously mentioned 3DO hits like Gex and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, etc., and other games in the Street Fighter 2 franchise. It had, you know, Tetris Plus. It had fucking Grand Theft Auto. It had Tomb Raider, Resident Evil 1 and 2. It had Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. It had Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, Tactics, Chronicles. I mean, just fuck. It was hit after hit after hit after hit. Metal Gear Solid, Twisted Metal, fucking Gran Turismo, I mean, god damn, the list just went on and on and on and on. Pretty much, if a game was made, it was made for PlayStation and then ported elsewhere. And this pattern continues to this day. I know what you're going to say in the comments. I'm a PlayStation fangirl. No, I'm not. I mean, yes, I have since gotten into PlayStation more than others, but I used to be very anti-PlayStation. I was very pro-Sega, pro-Nintendo for the longest fucking time. Alright? So don't at me with that bullshit, because it ain't fucking true. And if I had the money, I would own a Switch. So eat shit. However, the Saturn wasn't all bad. Likewise, the PlayStation wasn't all good. The Saturn had a slight advantage over the PlayStation in the early days, in that the Saturn had internal storage built in, so you didn't have to run out and buy memory cards right off the bat to play your console. You could save games to the internal memory. You could buy memory cards to expand that, but you didn't have to. PlayStation wasn't functional without a memory card, for the most part. When it came down to 3D games, fanboys can just shut up. PlayStation did it better. Saturn was wonky at best when it came to 3D, and garbage most of the time. The rest of the time, it didn't look good compared to the PlayStation. It didn't look good compared to the N64, and sometimes it didn't even look good compared to the 32X or the Jaguar. The Saturn, whether or not the technical hardware was technically on paper superior to PlayStation or not, is irrelevant. What matters is the final fucking product, and just because it was hard to develop for is no excuse to put out shitty ass, butt ugly looking fucking games, which is all you got on the Saturn, for the most part. I am a Sega nerd. I love Sega. Genesis is one of my favorite game consoles of all time. I love the Sega CD, the Master System, the Game Gear, the 32X, Sega arcade games. I love Sega. My Steam handle is Sega Gamer 12. The Saturn is fucking rubbish. It is not worth a shit. I jumped ship because the Saturn fucking blew chunks up my ass, and I wasn't ready for that, and I wasn't willing to deal with it. And that's just the reality. Now, aftermarket, the Saturn can eat shit as well, because a game that you can get on PlayStation, which will generally run smoother, look a little better, sometimes have better special features, but not always. But in general, run really well and smooth and playable on the PlayStation, will run you about $7 or $8 used. That same game on the Saturn, which again is sometimes an inadequate port, but not always, but for the most part, yes, will run you $70, $80. Jesus fucking Christ. The Saturn ain't worth it. It ain't fucking worth the money. It wasn't back in the day, and it sure as fuck ain't today. I have nothing good to say about the Saturn. Not even Nights into Dreams. Didn't do it for me. You know? I'd rather play Spyro the Dragon or Crash Bandicoot. Or fuck it. I'd rather play fucking Bubsy 3D than that piece of shit. Okay, that's a lie. But you get the point.